So yes, the meeting is recorded. Thanks everyone for joining us. I am Melissa Mialon. I'm a food engineer and a researcher in public health nutrition. I am the co-coordinator of our GECI network, so GECI for Governance, Ethics and Conflict of Interest in Public Health. We have a Twitter account. Some of you, I think, are already following us, and that's where we advertise our webinars and other new posts and things that we have on our website. We also have a website on the web pages of the American University of Beirut, and that's where we are hosted as a network. I'd like to thank Habir and Sarah from the American University of Beirut, who are supporting us today with the technical assistance. So if you have any issue with the connection or hearing us or anything, you can type a message and send it to Habir or Sarah. Today, our webinar will focus on the risks and threats faced by individuals working on corporations in health. When we saw the list of attendees who registered, we thought that many of you probably know of those risks and threats, and we were discussing with Paula. Some of you may even have faced a lot more things that we will be discussing. So we are hoping to have a part where we will be presenting, but also we hope to have a discussion and maybe finish before the hour, so that those of you who have other meetings after, you have time for some rest. So I'll start with a presentation on a specific industry, which is the food industry, and then I'll introduce Paula, which is she will be the second speaker. At the end, there will be a discussion, so you can start putting your discussion, your questions, if you have any questions or comments, in the chat box. There is a Q&A option as well. I'm not sure if it's working today, but you have the chat anyway. And just a comment for those of you who will be commenting, we had some sessions where people from the industry has listened. We had some feedback after. So know that if you share any information, it's public information because anyone can listen, and then the recording is also available online. So any sensitive information, maybe that's not, if it's too sensitive, that's not the best platform maybe to share it. So I'll share my screen. Oops. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So I'll start with a presentation of the threats and risks faced by individuals working on corporations and health, with a specific example of the food industry. And sorry, I'm a researcher at Trinity Business School, Trinity College, Dublin in Ireland. As an introduction, I wanted to say that what I'll be presenting is an overview of the threats and risks, but it's certainly not exhaustive. It's based on my own research and what people have shared during, I'm doing interviews for my research. So people have shared specific examples. Some of these examples, I was never able to share them in my publications because it's too sensitive. It could put people at risk. And this is also based beyond my research on my experience as a researcher in trying to publish on this topic of conflicts of interest, ethics, industry influence. This presentation is also very much based on discussions that I had with other researchers and public health advocates along the year working in that space. And I would like to thank all of my colleagues who have raised those issues of the threats that we face. And I had some platforms to discuss that. And we wish that the webinar today is another platform for us to discuss those issues. And then there is also little evidence. There is some evidence, little evidence in the literature of those threats and risks, mostly for the tobacco industry. So the presentation is based on that, but it's not exhaustive at all. It's also a classification of the different threats and risks that I've done myself from the experience again and everything, but it's not comprehensive. I'd like also to say that when we talk of risks and threats, it's not just against individuals who work on illegal practices, who denounce frauds or corruption. It's for people who discuss, like me, of the influence of corporations on science or the influence of corporations on policy. But it's even individuals who don't even talk of these corporations or of any specific brands. It might just be that people are talking of healthy foods, for example, and less healthy foods. So you don't even have to target a specific company to be threatened by it. Then the threats are not always from a specific company or from the industry. So sometimes it comes from third parties, and they will ask you to just stop saying what you're saying against a specific product or a specific company, but it's not always obvious that it's that company who is threatening you. So they will ask, they will work through third parties and others, and I'll have some specific examples. So yes, just to say that it's not always advocates. We are not talking of advocates like those working in Greenpeace and being very, very vocal against that industry. And it's not always the big bad industry who is also threatening us. Sometimes it's other third parties. And then I think what is important also with that presentation that we are making today is that there is a clear contradiction between the public image and the discourse that corporations in the tobacco industry, alcohol industry, gambling industry, food, pharma industries, all of those industries, they have a certain image in the public, and they present themselves as being part of the solutions, as bringing us with prosperity and jobs. But in reality, the few of us who are denouncing their practices or just trying to protect public health are the ones who are threatened by this industry. So the contradiction between what they say in public and then what they do in private spaces to researchers and public advocates to me, it's quite challenging and also saying of that industry, those industries. So the first type of risk or threat is the criticism of the person. So this is from on the top of that slide. We are about to publish on the political practices of the food industry in Brazil. And a member of the government told us, I remember the threat to a high-ranking official, and they always make that person understand that they could get her fired from the Ministry of Health. So it's threatening because you don't like what the person is saying. So you target a specific individual. In Fiji, at the bottom of the slide, we had a study of again the political activity of food companies, and another person, a person again from the government was saying us, why am I sitting here in this kind of job that didn't like as much as being a politician today? There were some groups of people associated with the food industry who wanted me out of government. There were various representations high up the line where they didn't like the things which were happening. This criticism of the person can happen to researchers quite isolated, maybe not highly visible to the public, but it also happens with high-ranking officials. Then there is a criticism of the work. So for the food industry, for example, there is this example with the NOVA classification of food. So the NOVA classification is based on the degree of processing. That to say, minimally processed foods are quite healthy to consume. And then on the other side of that, you have ultra processed foods, which consumption has been associated with ill health. And there is evidence for that in the scientific literature. but this work is getting criticized, and we've done an analysis of who was criticizing that concept, that classification of food, and most of these people were related to the food industry. So it was not directly the food industry, but the food industry had connections with certain people from the US, from Brazil, from France, and those scientists who were quite close to the industry. They were criticizing the work of colleagues working on the NOVA classification. So it was not specifically on one individual, but it was questioning the work of different groups of individuals working on the NOVA classification. You also have threats to the person. So beyond criticism, I know of people who received phone calls telling them that they knew where their kid was and that they were following their kids after schools, emails to complain about our work, and sometimes it takes us a lot of time to respond to these emails, and sometimes our universities makes us obliged to respond to the emails. So it's taking a lot of time for many of us to respond to the criticism and the threats. Sometimes we have threats. Then you have indirect threats. So researchers unwilling to publish on any criticism of the food industry. So I had on several occasions co-authors who have worked with me in different countries, and at the last minute, because they were too afraid that the industry will go against them, then they decided to withdraw from the publication, not even being acknowledged in the publication. And that's, clearly they've told me because they were worried of the possible implications that it could have for them if they were threatened or sued or by the industry. I never had any problem, but I know that on several occasions, again, my colleagues were just too worried. I had another occasion where an employer was pressuring a colleague not to publish with me because the employer wasn't happy with what we were saying. We were denouncing the political practices of the food industry, and that was not pleasing the employer. And then here there is an example from Australia. Again, the political practices of the food industry in that country. An academic was telling us, if the food industry rings me or email me directly, I feel like there is no protection for me, and they can be quite threatening. They do feel that they've got the right to call personally or contact me personally, and I can tell them I can't talk to them and I refer them elsewhere. But sometimes that doesn't stop them saying what they want to say. So they can be quite threatening and call people directly. So the industry is also making our work complicated. Of course, that's making our work complicated. So they will have freedom of information requests to our universities. So asking to see, for example, the data from our research, the email exchange between researchers. Sometimes there is no specific objective in doing that, just to delay you. And that was very much true, for example, in the case of the tobacco industry and researchers working in tobacco control. It's just a way of delaying your work and asking you to do a lot of things so that instead of working on tobacco control, then you just get to respond to those emails. Then you also have the food industry or people who are close to the industry involved in peer review, in grants, in scientific journals, and others. For example, in Australia, an academic told us they try to undermine our authority, but also in semi-confidential systems that actually affect our career and research possibilities. I think they're very, very powerful. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's real. In my own research, for example, I have submitted an article to a scientific journal, and after 9 months, so they kept the the article, but after 9 months, they replied that qualitative research was not really research after all, so they will decline reviewing my article, and it took them 9 months to do that. So that's quite unusual. And when I looked at the editor who had that response, then the editor was quite close to the industry. So I'm not sure, and he was close to the industry in the country that I was studying for the specific publication. So I cannot say if it's a coincidence, but it was a bad example for us. They also make our work complicated by being a source of funding and of employment. So in Chile, for example, we had a researcher telling us some researchers worked on a product, and it turned out that the product they were studying did not work, and the researchers published the results anyway. That means that the company took out the money that they gave to the university. So sometimes the industry is a source of money. So then, if you criticize them or if you are not happy with their product, then they withdraw the money that they are giving you or giving your university. So then you stop criticizing them. There is also the suppression of research. In Chile, for example, again, a colleague has done a study and the results were not pleasing the industry, and they were expressly asked to change the results. They ask us to falsify the data. So sometimes, if they don't like the research, it has been also documented for the tobacco industry. Corporations are trying to suppress your research, so you don't get you cannot publish, or they ask you to retract your publications. That's another way of just delaying our work or making it impossible to publish. Then there is the litigation or the threats to litigate. In my experience, for the food industry, this is not very much happening, and people have told me that litigation is not very much happening in this field because there is not much to litigate against. So because we don't have yet many mandatory policies that would restrict the sales of food products, then the industry is not litigating. There is an example from Brazil. Someone was saying, a former staff from the food industry, anything that you do that can criticize their brand, they threat to sue. And if you do not stop your criticism, they will sue you. And litigations are costly in Brazil, and they tend to take some time to proceed. So usually critics prefer to stop criticizing. And that was also the case in Colombia, where public health advocates tried to put an advertisement that was just showing the true content of sugar in the advertisement, and encouraging people to decrease their consumption of soft drinks. And that was censored on TV because the TV channel was owned by a group that also owns the soft drink company. So and it went to the court, so that's why it's considered to be under this category of litigation. The case went to the court, and eventually the public health advocates, they won because they were not saying anything that was wrong. They were just informing the public. But yes, that has happened. In Fiji here, again, it's a civil society organization who told us we were threatened a few years ago, right at the 11th hour, the day before we were supposed to go and present our work. We started receiving faxes from some of the biggest and richest law firms in Fiji, who represent some of the big companies, mostly the local ones, not so much the international, but the local ones, because what we had to say was compromising for them. And we had to withdraw our press releases at the 11th hour because they actually threatened, if it goes public, we will sue you. We had to withdraw everything. In that case, it was not a big thing. It was a study of food products, just telling the truth against to the public, the content of sugar and things like that in food products. But it was enough just to for the civil society to withdraw its event. Then there is the surveillance and infiltration. So it's a bit more tricky to get information on that. But I've learned, from my interviews about those practices. So you have small cameras. It's like a James Bond movie, but we know that in some countries they use those, for example, pencils where you have cameras, and so then they can take videos in public meetings of what people are saying. They also infiltrate IT networks, and can change the data that you are working on. I've seen it as well in Latin America. And then here an example from Colombia. We feel unsafe, yes, we must, because we have realized that there are many people who are behind each person to see that they write on what they write on their cell phones. When the plenary sessions are large, we have noticed that they take pictures with cameras with such a small lens, without lying to you, without exaggeration. So it's just threatening, for people to be followed all the time and to have pictures of them being taken, and you don't really know what people will do with those pictures. But that's another form of threat. Here I have some examples. So Nestle, for example, in Switzerland, they spied on a group of activists who was writing a book about Nestle and its practices in the country. So an employee from Nestle infiltrated that group of book writers. So the employee, just reported then what was being discussed and what was being put into the book. And Nestle was found guilty for having spied on that group. There is also, so it's a war room on the left-hand side of that slide. A war room is something that most large companies will have. It's not just the food industry, and it's it's not just against people who are working on food products or conflicts of interest or anything. A war room is a part of the company where you have people looking at social media on a daily basis, and every day, and on a real-time also basis. So every time that there is a tweet or a message on social media that is critical of your industry or of your company or of a product, then you know that in real time and you can respond to that also in real time. So Nestle, for example, here as one, there is a big map in the room where you can see, it's coloring when on the map of the world there is someone tweeting, for example, against you. So they have a lot of resources also to respond to the criticism. I think in Nestle there were 10 people, and that was 5 years ago, just for doing that. And then I was saying that it's not always the food industry directly. So that's on the right-hand side. It's an example from Mexico, where there was a spyware installed on the mobile phones of academics and public health advocates in Mexico. And the spyware was, sending them threatening emails. And it was clearly related to the work that they were doing. They were trying to pass some public health laws and discussing the unhealthiness of some products. But then it was the Mexican government who had made those spyware being installed on the mobile phones, and it was an Israeli company who developed the spywares. So it's not, it's not clear where the food industry was involved, but public health advocates working on the food industry and its products were targeted. The industry is also creating antagonism. So here in Australia, for example, they will then get people who argue that physical activity is more important than nutrition. They basically have the nutritionists and the public health people and the physical activity people fighting each other. That meant neither of them could do anything. So this was a deliberate tactic to get physical activity and the nutrition people arguing among themselves so much that neither of them could actually do anything. So that's also a classic way of distracting us, in public health, so making us argue within, amongst ourselves about what's wrong, what's right, and they will fund, certain groups and not others, and then that distracts us from discussing about those corporations. There is also the co-option. So in Chile here, when they see that there is a researcher who is entering an area that could be potentially threatening, they absorb him, incorporate him into their networks through hiring or offer you things. So that academic, was working on something that could have been threatening for the industry. So the industry, instead of fighting against that person or his research, they offered him a position within the industry. And I had that as well before. When I started doing my research, I was, so I'm a food engineer. So I've been trained by people from food corporations, but then when I started publishing on the political practices of corporations from a public health perspective, I got approached by some companies and they've asked me if I wanted to work within them. And, you have the argument that you can change them from the inside, that are trying to change and willing to change. So that's one other option, to co-opt public health researchers. And often people who work in corporate social responsibility, for example, are good people, are people who are really trying to make a difference. So that co-option is also quite powerful within the industry, because then you have people who speak our language and that we can talk with, but then, the intentions of the industry are quite different than ours. In conclusion, there is a need for a space where we could have that discussion. I've just presented, a few examples and categories that I've tried to make up, but we need to learn from each other. We need also solutions how to address, these threats and risks. There is a need for protection and support, particularly for those in low and middle income countries. The researchers and the public health advocates in those countries have limited possibilities to protect themselves. So we're hoping that through our network, for example, we could help each other. That's one way, I think, of just trying to stop those threats and just decreasing the risks. I think we also have to recognize that the system is somehow captured. The boards, for example, that review grants, when there is industry-friendly academics in those boards, then they will never fund the type of research that we are doing on corporations and conflicts of interest. The same for journal editors who may have interactions with the industry, or who may receive advertisements for their scientific journals from the industry. Then they might be less likely to publish our research because of the financial incentives that they have. Our universities also, there are different branches in our universities. So sometimes our life is complicated because our universities have ties with corporations. There are limited resources for civil society in trying to protect themselves from those threats and risks. So again, I think there is a need for better support and protection for them. The media, I was mentioning scientific journals and advertisements, but it's very much true for the media. So when you try to publish something, a piece of your work in the media, sometimes it's complicated because the media receives so much money from the industry through advertisements and maybe the links of journalists with corporations. There is also a lack of investigative journalism, a lack of interest by the media in investigative journalism, which is very useful at just sharing information on conflicts of interest and this type of things. So these are some, I think, limitations of our current system beyond just the threats and risks of working on this corporation. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. And now we'll have the second speaker. So I'll introduce you briefly. Thanks, Paula, for being with us. So Paula Jones is a Brazilian. She's the co-founder and director of ACT Health Promotion, which is a Brazilian coalition of over 1,000 members. It was originally created to support the process of ratification and implementation of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in Brazil. But then ACT has expanded to work also on the agenda of NCDs more broadly. So Paula will be doing the second presentation, and then we will have question and answers. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. It's always challenging to talk when we cannot see anybody. We don't really know how we are seen or heard. But that's what we have for the moment, and it's great to have this discussion. I think Mel has already advanced a lot of what I'll bring a couple of practical examples. I'm going to share here, and then somebody please tell me if you can see it. Is it okay? Yeah, okay. On an individual note, I've never really been personally threatened, like physically or something like that. But I think that there are more subtle ways of intimidating people and individuals and organizations, and there are so many examples from other areas as well. I mean, this is not an extensive investigation or review or any attempt to be comprehensive about all the forms that it takes place. I think Mel has already brought some more thoughtful categorization of the types, but I'm just from the conversations I've had with journalists and researchers and other advocates and activists from other organizations and government representatives and legislators, that there are so many of the examples that were described by Melissa. There is the basic one, I think, when we talk about research, is this pressure to fire somebody or not renew research grants and not fund research of certain issues. And I mean, I know some cases, and we don't need to say the names here, but I know in the area of alcohol, for example, that a very well-known researcher in this area had to move from the university he used to be linked with because of pressures from the real upper level of the university. And there are really and then there are also threats in the form of Melissa already brought them, to withdraw publications and not want to be associated. One that I've experienced several times, it's just that people not want to associate themselves with even being near somebody who is perceived what's not actually a threat, but that happens very often, including among other organizations, is that when they try to build a narrative or build the profile of the person, and that one I'm pretty much into as being too radical, too extreme, and not wanting to have dialogues and not wanting to bring real solutions, and just being too radical about everything and too critical and this and that. And that's always, and that sometimes takes place, for example, with legislators and politicians that don't want to even be seen with you because that would be something regarding the connections that they have, or what types of industry, or some people, some legislators that have been very supportive of certain issues, regulatory issues, and then they disappear. And that could be for two reasons: either because they have received some financial or some offerings, or because or any types of threats in the form of saying, oh, if you keep on working on this agenda issue, we are gonna do something on your jurisdiction so you don't get any votes from there. So that's another form of threatening politicians, that it's not a real threat, but it's a threat we are going to move the votes in your region. And we have seen a lot of that in the area of tobacco. Cooptation, it's a basic one. One that we have a lot in the area of tobacco, it's like these trawlers or these hate groups, some individuals that everywhere there is any news stories about anything related to tobacco control, he goes there and says, it's all fake, it's not, this is a lie, and this is this, and this is that. So we have like this group of haters and trawlers, and it's even hard to have conversations with even with the media, because they go there and really try disturbing the conversations that for the issues that we're talking about. I brought one particular example that I've been part of. I once, when we were discussing the FCDC ratification in Brazil, where we are major tobacco leaf producers, so there was a very strong reaction from the producers that are concentrated in South Brazil. There is a picture here of just the southern part of Brazil, and there is this tiny little city there in red in the middle. And this is Santa Cruz do Sul. It's the tobacco capital in Brazil. So all the economy and everything there, it's around like the tobacco industry and the tobacco production. The picture there, it's the portal of the city with a BAT, the Brazilian BAT logo. And obviously, everybody, the media, the local media, and everything, it's really has very strong links with the industry. And even if you don't agree, if you say anything like critical of the industry, you have consequences just by living in the city. So I did have contact with some people that would not agree with a lot or would be critical of tobacco or something, but they could never express it publicly in that city. And I once went there when we were having the discussions about the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in Brazil. And I had to hide in a church-like place, because if I was seen with some of the people that were like from farmers movement, the local farmers movement, that were having these interesting conversations about how we could move forward with the health agenda of tobacco, and at the same time provide guarantees and safeguards for the tobacco, the small tobacco growers. So I had to hide, because if I were seen together with these people, they would completely discredit the movement. So that's another way that seems that happened. I was kind of surprised, and there were like situations also in that same place there. You have like thousands and thousands of people gather against this treaty, and basically funded with like through mayors and so on, but funded with industry money just to be against and create a big media buzz around that this treaty will be really harmful for their city, for their jobs. So that's a kind of a more like social threat that the city will basically disappear if we move forward with the tobacco regulations, including smoke-free policies. So they would come, even we're discussing a smoke-free policy, and I mean, that's not quite a major thing in terms of like, it doesn't even target the industry, but they will use this kind of collectively threat to say that, well, this will really destroy our livelihoods if you do anything in that direction. So that's a kind of, it's a more like social threat, I would say. There are many examples, countless examples in the area of pesticides, of researchers that are publishing research about the impact of pesticides on health, or GMOs and so on. There are many examples. I just out of curiosity, before last week, I was sending some messages in some groups that gather around pesticides control. And like, I don't know how many, I received kind of dozen examples of situations in which they were threatened within the categories that maybe it's already went through, like to withdraw research money, or like being like getting a notice from the dean of that particular university saying that they were not credible enough. So this attack to the personal credibility of the researchers. And I brought this one here because I think this is an example, not of a threat, but it's also, again, where this type of threats and how they happen in very subtle ways, and sometimes not so subtle. But that was a quote from the back then DJ from WHO, Margaret Chan, and then she made a really strong statement about that in the Public Health Promotion Conference back in 2013, criticizing not only big tobacco, but also like big food, big alcohol, all the industries, and what are the tactics that they do to protect themselves by using the same tactics. And then I had a chance, and that's a kind of a bit anecdotal, but probably there is ways of like confirming that talk from her later on. A couple of years later, in a smaller conference, it was a tobacco control conference in India, and then she said, well, what I said in Helsinki really put me in trouble. So, I mean, of course, this type of like pressure, when you start being critical about the tactics of those big industries, they happen at all levels, not only individual activity levels, but these people that hold those positions, these high-level positions in UN agencies, in governments, they receive all sorts of threats that they should not be too vocal about this type of stuff. So I think this is a kind of relevant example for the discussions in this kind of different levels that it happens and in more or less subtle ways. And here it's something that I've perhaps somebody here, I don't know who the audience is, but it's a slide that I love to show because the context of it is that I took once public relations, a lobbying course carried out by an industry-friendly institution, academic institution that has, that does a training for lobbyists. So they teach lobbyists from the major corporations how they need to act and how they need to deal with government people and how they can become really good lobbyists for the cause of those industries. And I was the only person in that course from the civil society organization. All of them, they were from industry or industry-funded foundations. So it was like a great experience. I really recommend it. as I take for my basic assumption is they will always know what we are doing. So I don't care too much about what I say or I don't say because I always assume that they know it anyways. Whether they are spying or not spying or putting some people to attend specific meetings or not, I always assume that they always do. They always know what we are doing. So it's a bit of okay, we should also know, also be in the forums where they are gathered together and thinking about their strategies. And that was a great opportunity for that part. And it was interesting because from the beginning, I was completely transparent about who I was and where I came from. And then the teacher, after a few seconds of being a bit surprised, and he was, oh, this is great because this is here, it's for everyone and so on. We are all the same and we all do the same and we all want the same. And then as the course would, go on, I would just say, well, there are lots of things that I said, but it seems like we are not, it seems that there are some different fields, in terms of what you are teaching the people, what to do or not to do. And one of the basic lessons is for people for these lobbyists to be always nice. And that's very common. That's why, that's somehow why also we also perceived as radicals, because we are always the voice that come out there criticizing practices and so on. And they are always the nice ones that want to contribute to solutions, and that's something that they teach in this course for lobbyists. Another thing which I found very interesting, which is what comes to this slide, it's that how they perceive NGOs in terms of they think that, well, you have to have NGOs as allies because they have more credibility in most issues. And this is actual research that the industry does to map who is who and the different stakeholders, has more credibility or not. And actually that's good news for whoever is from NGOs, because despite all the difficulties that we may have in the field, we're still perceived as with more credibility than the industries themselves. So I think that's the part of it which is good news. But then it's just the entire course was framed around how to avoid regulation. And this one, it's just like the perfect mapping of how you can see whether it's moving forward or not. So if you see there, like it's very cold when nobody's talking about few and rare interest among stakeholders. It's getting warm if there is regulation in other jurisdictions, but not yet debated in Brazil. It's warming up if there are more stakeholders promoting. And it's really hot if the regulation is consolidating in other jurisdictions. So that's why it's important. And what happens anywhere might be important for anywhere else, because that might be the start of some movements and bigger movement happening. And if it comes to the media, wow, that's really like it's getting dangerous. And then if you have like the last one, you have a big NGO debating the issue and you have media attention, if society is worried about this issue, wow, this can become a real high risk in the future. And this is the exact language that they have in the course, okay? So the regulatory risk, the probability of happening, and I can just see like what we do kind of moving upstream. In the case, for example, smoke-free policies, wow, we really got to the other end of the spectrum here. So I think it was an important lesson to see like how the mindset around these issues function. And then like a couple of years ago, that was 2018, almost 3 years ago now, it's like I first received a couple of offers from Coca-Cola to become friends with them and to participate in some call for proposals that they were having about agroecology and this and that, and wanted to have like to network and to have conversations, and well, no thanks, not willing to do that. And then like we kept on doing our regular work of like exposing the risks of sugary drinks and so on. And then we had the Brazilian nutrition conference. And then we did like this huge, inspired by Mexico, we did this huge like inflatable can there, written diabetes instead of Coca-Cola. And then I received an intimidation letter immediately after. We have also, in the past, we have also received intimidations. We have been sued by the tobacco industry in the past because of 30 seconds advertisement that we had about tobacco, point of sale advertisement of tobacco. And that was a real lawsuit. In the case of Coca-Cola, it was just intimidation, like stop doing that. If you continue doing that, we're going to sue you. And the same, this is just like I brought here just to show you. I mean, fortunately, we do have a strong group of investigative journalism in Brazil, particularly in the area of food policy issues. And the Joio Trigo, they are simply great. And they were also received an intimidation from Coca-Cola because of some stories they published in the website. The argument was more about like asking them to take it out take it out of their website. And I love the way that they responded to it, because it was like, okay, Coca-Cola, the Coke can that was here asked to leave, but they forgot to take the sugar together with them. I think that was a very, very good response to this type of threat. But then, I mean, this type of intimidation, I will speak now on like how frustrated I can become when, for example, if you want to continue on doing something like this diabetes inflatable can, it's amazing how many protection they have for saying whatever they want. And we cannot say anything, not even like basic stuff. Now we just been censored because of a campaign we wanted to put in the Brazilian, in the Rio, here in Rio, like a metro station. We wanted to put a campaign like promoting like taxation of sugary beverage, and we were censored. And that's not something that it's open, but it's a kind of a threat that goes through third parties, for example, the people that control this underground station that were said, oh, you're not going to put anything from that organization anymore, like even if you pay the advertisement for that. And then we go to the lawyers to try to find, okay, we want to go out in public with that campaign, saying only like facts about like how many people get diabetes and what's the impact of sugar, blah, blah, blah. And then the lawyers get back to us, oh, no, this is too dangerous. We can't even use, sometimes we can't even use the color red. It's kind of, so it's amazing how they create this web that really protects the commercial rights that they have, and we cannot even say the basic health facts about what the impact of the product causes. So I think that's an issue for reflection. I went here because, so we have, I don't think we have a lot of time, but that's something that I was thinking, that I've been thinking through a lot, because I think we are, in the beginning of this pandemic, I was thinking, oh, we are having a huge opportunity to rethink how we organize collectively in this world. And maybe we can build back better. Maybe we can rethink some of the structural problems that we have in front of us. And then it makes me think about this thing of like how much they organize around avoiding risk for their profits. But I think we are forgetting something, which is the risk of avoiding all risks. And we are basically consuming 1.6 of the planet as the current model of production and consumption. We can talk about most of those industries, right? It's not about a particular industry. It's more like how they operate in a way that they don't pay for the externalities and the impact of their business. And we are just like burning the planet. And it's sad, like, to see that all the problems that we already had before the pandemic, they have not become better at right now as we sit here. They actually increasing. I mean, wealth, it's more concentrated than ever in a horrific scenario where people are dying and people have got, the wealthy are getting even wealthier. So I think we have a huge challenge ahead of us. And it's really like amazing that we can't even say the truth about like of the information we have in terms of health impact. And hello from Rio to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paula. So we don't have much time for this unless people want to stay, and we can continue having that discussion. There is a question from Colin. What about to focus on whistleblower protections? How common and how effective is this where it exists? Paula, do you want to answer that maybe for Brazil and Latin America?
I'm really not aware of whether the protection works and how effective that is. And the examples also I have from environmental groups and environmental activists are not so good in terms of like having actually effective protection. So I think it's an important point to be discussed.
Yeah, no, and yeah. we did a review of what mechanisms exist to try to address and avoid that undue influence from corporations, and part of that was a protection of whistleblowers, and there is not much policy, not much implementation of that. There are some examples of charities, I think, in Europe, and there is one group also in Africa who is trying to protect whistleblowers, but it's very specific. I think helping one individual after the other, they don't have a lot of resources. So unless it's implemented by law, I'm not sure how we can really protect these people. And if anyone wants to comment on that from the audience, please feel free to comment. So we don't have any other question. Is there? If anyone wants to speak, I think we can also unmute their microphones. So I think Patty is raising her hand. Sarah or Javier, can we unmute Patty if she wants to make a comment? Patty, if you have a question, can you maybe?
And here
you can.
Oh
okay,
yes,
great.
here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I just wondered, given the long time that IPFAN has been doing all this and the threats, the whole history of ours is just like yours. Full of these threats and yes. Whistleblowers and everything, and how many films have been made now. And I just wondered, is it getting any better or worse now, do you think, in terms of, from where I'm sitting, I don't get attacks. I really don't get the same attacks since I got that award from the Queen. You know, people gave it to me in order to protect me because I used to be called all sorts of things. But now it's more the multi-stakeholder, we're all friends with you. And as long as you come, and this is the new thing that I am most terrified about, is the way they present themselves as, I mean, you mentioned, Melissa, somebody just being offered a job or whatever. We're all in this together and we're all going to go there. That is, to me, the worst thing, you know, and I've been listening to the Bill Gates even, you know, just these technology transfer from the top right down to the south. It's really scary how many people are being taken in by that. And so it's not an aggression anymore. It's less for me. It's not seen as an aggression. It's anything to get you on side and show them that they're willing to admit that things are wrong, but they want to be the ones to fix it and to be in that thing. And I just wondered if others have had the same experience. And I think it's very tricky to comment on that, you know, to actually do something about that, because people want the industry to do something better. They don't realize they're being led into something that's really very dangerous and affects the governance. What do you, I mean, I don't know.
No, I just feel like, you know, just having done this research in multiple countries, you know, high income, low income, it doesn't really matter. Most people I've talked to, you know, and in each country it's 20, 25 people that I've talked to, and in all of those countries, I've heard people who are, you know, threatened even personally. So it's still happening. You know, people are just not talking about it. And then, yes, of course, you have, you know, this corruption of the language and of the people, and so then it's also a big issue. But the threatenings are still happening.
Are still happening. Okay, so it's as bad at different levels, and it works. It works really easily, doesn't it? From a midwife, from anybody, they're frightened for the job, and yeah. Paula, yeah.
No, I think, hi, nice to hear from you. Yeah. Well, I think the chilling effect, it's one of the worst ones. And I would agree with you. I think the individual threats, what makes a difference is where you are in the political spectrum in a certain jurisdiction, right? Right now in Brazil could be very dangerous because we have like a kind of a crazy federal government. In other places as well, where, I mean, what's the level of the democratic system, less or more authoritarian at given times. But I agree with you that the subtle one, that what you call, I mean, this muting, like, I mean, this thing of like being like the solution without talking about what's really going on. I mean, the diversionism, I think that's the major threat to all of us, the diversionism from the real issues. And I think that's happening in a level that never unseen before. But on the other hand, because it's so horrible right now, I'm always the optimist in the room in terms of like, it's getting so bad that we're probably approaching a tipping point at some point. And I think it's getting really bad when we think about the externalities, and then we can talk about across all these industries, right? If you have fossil fuels, and I mean, in terms of the impact on health, I mean, you can talk about all of them. And it's really, really, really bad right now. So I hope that we are approaching the tipping point.
Hopefully. Yeah. When people wake up, they'll be. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Betty.
And it's very scary when it happens, isn't it?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Anybody? There was a question from Anna Levy. I'm not aware, maybe Paula, you are, of anyone aggregating the letters of threat, intimidation, etc. Linked back to specific companies. I'm not aware of anyone who is doing that, because, you know, not many people just speak about those threats. So
it depends where you are.
Paula, we can't hear you anymore. I think you are muted.
No, I think it depends on where you are, and I think some of that just goes through conversations. I don't have like a lot of documentation, because a lot of what happens, I mean, it's not like it's not a written threat, it's not an official threat, right? It happens in different ways. So I find it really hard to record, and I think a basic one, I mean, when people live in like this type of society that we live, that you need to survive. I mean, if you threat like the livelihood of your wife or husband or whatever companion, that can have an impact in your life, and you might have to shut up. I mean, there's all sorts of different threats in different ways that at the end they impact on people's livelihood, and people don't want to, and understandably enough, right, that you don't want to like be exposed.
Paula, again for you, there is a question from Amal Karaki. Can you share with us a successful story where you were able to confront the threat of a corporation on a specific issue?
I think that visibility is a good thing. I think that that's also what Patty talked about, like in a way, right? Because when you are like when people know, when you have a strong voice about a certain issue, that somehow is a protective factor. I've said horrible things about the tobacco industry and about all the others, and I've never received like a direct threat to myself, right? So I can say lots of things in different forums. So I think this. I would say that like visibility, it can be a protective factor if you have like media contacts and so on that you can approach, that can be helpful to get a success story in some areas.
Thanks, Paula. So I think that was the last question, and we went over the hour. So I think it's time just to say. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Paula, thanks to Abir and Sarah also, and to all attendees. And this will be made available on our website, the recording, so you can watch again and share also amongst your networks. Also, sorry, so I think there is if you have questions, please feel free to send us emails, and I'm sure Paula will also be happy to respond to your emails. So thanks everyone. Thanks a lot and stay safe.
Thank you, and thank you, Melissa. It's always nice discussing that. Bye.
Bye.